Then I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes, and I'll save questions till the end of that period, since it's a little bit clunky, the getting back and forth with the screen here. So what we're economics is actually largely a failed science. There's little of importance that we can predict or where we can change the outcomes. For example, why does income of a person across countries vary by 50 to 1? Why did the Industrial Revolution occur only around 1800? 10,000 years after the agrarian societies. I'm getting echo now. For the determination of social status and its inheritance across generations, we do find, however, actual simple, powerful patterns and laws. And these suggest much stronger social status inheritance than conventionally believed. And they also suggest that the determination of status is by additive genetics with very little ability of society to shape this by social means. The talk today is going to be based in part on my book from 2014 and also from this recent paper in PNAS on the inheritance of social status, if people want to look at that. So the conventional beliefs in social mobility are that there's lots of variation in the rate of social mobility across societies. That social mobility is heavily dependent on institutions and government policy. And also there's the suggestion that many societies have suboptimal mobility in the sense that there's a misallocation of talent to positions in the society. And we can illustrate this with the following diagram, which shows the correlation of years of education between a parent and a child, and then a measure of the inequality of income within a society. And this is for the last 20 years. And you can see that that correlation is very much lower in Scandinavia, in Nordic societies. It's at intermediate levels in places like the United States, and it's at very high levels in Peru and Brazil. And it seems to suggest that there really are these important social differences between societies in terms of how persistent educational status is, and that seem to be created by differences in social institutions. And the only problem is that we have really no idea why exactly these rates of persistence of status are so different across different societies. But as I say, the persistent image is actually of a social world that varies a lot between different societies. But a systematic problem in any discussion of social status and social mobility is that all measures of social status, things like years of education, income, occupational status, or wealth, they're all highly imperfect measures of true social status. The observed status is some variable y, which relates to true status only with some kind of measurement error. And that actually says that the observed persistence between generations or the correlation between siblings is always some attenuated measure of the true persistence within the society. And the degree of that attenuation is going to depend on what's the variance of the underlying true status of people and what's the variance of the various error terms that are intruding. And that actually means that if you have a more homogeneous society in terms of the distribution of abilities, you'll actually observe less social mobility than in a society where there are great disparities between different groups in the society in terms of the distribution of abilities. And also over time, these error terms can change very significantly. And so, as I say, a systematic problem in any discussion of social mobility is that we don't get to see what are the true measures of status. And to show another example here, we have for marriage records in England, good estimates of the father to son correlation in occupational status that go all the way from 1837 up to the present. And you can see that that number actually declines very significantly over time, implying that the modern world has much more social mobility than the earlier world. But again, the description of occupations has changed radically over this period. And so we don't know to what extent is this caused by the looseness of description of occupations now compared to earlier, or to what extent is there actually significant changes going on in the social world. And so what I want to talk about here is how to measure the persistence of status in a way that's independent of these measurement errors. And I'll show you three different methods. And the first one is to use actual surnames as a way of tracking status that's independent of measurement errors. There's another way, which is looking across correlations of different types of relatives to get the measurement errors to cancel out. And then a third way is to measure the decline in correlation with the genetic distance between people. And in a way, again, that it's the rate of decline of that correlation with distance is going to measure social mobility. Now, why are surnames a potential solution to the problems of measurement error? Because surnames are inherited, they link groups of people across generations. If we take a predefined group of surnames, and if that group is large enough, the measurement error of their average status becomes zero. And so if by some other measure, we can identify surnames that, say, in 1800 have unusually high average or unusually low average social status, by observing the rate at which the status of that group returns to the mean, we'll actually be able to get an unbiased measure of the true underlying rates of social mobility in the society. And how we do this in England is we take surnames that were held by less than 30 people in the 1881 census. Then we just look and partition those surnames and take the ones where at least one person with the name enrolled in Oxford or Cambridge from 1800 to 1829. And only 1% of all males in England would enroll in these universities then. And that identifies the surname as potentially of high average social status because it's got greater than average representation at the university. And then starting in the next generation, 1830 to 59, we look at how persistent is this above average status and how much more likely are those people with these surnames to enroll at Oxford and Cambridge compared to the general population in all subsequent years. And this graph shows the picture, and for this group, the relevant group is the one with the yellow squares. And in the period 1800 to 29, they were 64 times more likely than the average person to attend Oxford or Cambridge, people with these surnames. And then you can see that their relative representation at the university, their overrepresentation, is actually declining steadily with each generation as we move to the modern world. But what is interesting is that that rate of decline can be parsed into a persistence rate, an intergenerational correlation in status of roughly 0.77, which is much, much higher than all of the conventional measures of social status persistence. And you can see that those people who just happen to be descended, but now 6 generations later, from the original high status surname holders, are still almost 4 times as likely to be attending Oxford or Cambridge than the average person in Britain. And so you see then this very strong persistence of social status within Britain. And the second thing is that it's a very consistent persistence across multiple generations. But over these years, to go to Oxford and Cambridge in the mid-19th century, you had to learn Latin, and you had to sit particular entrance exams to gain entry to the university, and you had to find funding. When I went to Cambridge in 1975, the government provided the funding. Anyone from any school could apply to the university. The social situation had changed dramatically. But what is amazing is that there's a very consistent state of persistence of people in these elite groups through all of these educational changes. And the other important thing was, it wasn't until 1871 that there was any requirement for anyone to get educated in England. And it wasn't until even later than that the government actually provided for public support of education. And so what's amazing about this data is that we move between very different social regimes without hardly any great sign of improvements in the rate of social mobility. Now, if social status over generations is actually evolving, where X we measure with mean 0, where xt is going to be b times xt minus 1, that's the previous generation, plus some error term, then this parameter b should also measure the rise of rare name elites from average status. And so the process of decline of status over time should be symmetrical with the process of rise of status if you have this constant transmission mechanism of underlying status from one generation to the next. And if we go back to the diagram, what you can see is that we get exactly this phenomena. People in these rare surnames, elites, actually emerged from people who were very close to average if we go back to 1530. So they are still somewhat above average status. And then they actually steadily rise this group of names in status, but at the same rate as the later decline that comes for this surname group. And so what you actually, and again, you're going through radically different periods here. You're going through the Reformation, you're going through the English Civil War of the 17th century, the Puritan period, the arrival of the Hanoverians, the Whig ascendancy in England. And so what's amazing here, as I say, and also, of course, dramatically, the Industrial Revolution. And what's amazing then is the kind of underlying constancy of these implied social mobility rates revealed by surname distributions over a period of almost 500 years. And as I say, this surprising dynamic where there's both the decline of elites being observed, but also the creation of new elites also being observed in the data. Again, so looking at this diagram, we can actually have a second group of rare surnames in the figure. And these were names held by less than 30 people in 1881, where those with those names dying in this period were wealthy. We actually identify them by this very different measure of just were you wealthy or were you not wealthy. And what is interesting is that that group experiences a very similar dynamic. There's a slightly different persistence rate, but they show the same very strong persistence over time. And even though they were identified by their wealth, it turns out that they're also a very strong educational elite. And as I say, showing the same kind of rise and then decline again. And it has this idea that there's just a general kind of high level of social status that will show up in both education, wealth, income, and occupational status. And then we can go to medieval England from 1200 to 1500. So surnames had become standard in England by about 1300. Most people had them by then. 15% of them are from occupations, and most of these occupations are from the middle level of social status. So it's names like Smith, Mason, Baker, Butcher, and they typically describe artisanal occupations. And what we actually observe is that there are very few such surnames at Oxford and Cambridge in 1300. So the solid black line shows the relative representations of artisans' surnames at the university at that date. And what you can see is that in 1300, they're at something like 1/10 of their expected representation. But you see that by 1500, those names had actually risen to full representation relative to their share of the population in the university. And so deep in the Middle Ages, we can actually observe that there is a process of social mobility going on still. And it's taking people from the middle of the status distribution and then distributing them so that they're fully represented at the upper tail of the status distribution. And then we can calculate what rate of intergenerational persistence would actually be consistent in this simple model with the evolution of this name distribution that we're seeing. And it turns out that it's a correlation of about 0.8. The solid dashed line, sorry, the bold dashed line is the one that best fits the data. And so the implication is that social mobility rates in the Middle Ages were actually just as strong as they are in the last 20 years in England. But in each period, there's a great deal of persistence of status between generations. But the important thing to realize is in 1300, only about 1% of the population was literate in this society. And you still had a lot of the institutions of feudalism. But you're actually seeing rates of social mobility that look very similar to the ones that you observe in the modern. So the conclusion from these surname studies is that the correlation in status is high in all periods and across all measures. And it turns out that in that book from 2014, we also can look at what happens in other countries. And amazingly, Sweden, which shows on most measures of social mobility very high rates of intergenerational mobility, in terms of education, actually shows a persistent rate, which is very similar to England in the Middle Ages and very similar to modern England. This is also true for the United States. It's true for Australia. It's true for Chile. It's true for Hungary, even in the communist era and then post the communist era. And so there is this kind of surprising evidence that status persists very strongly between generations, no matter what the measures that are contaminated with error would actually suggest for these countries. And then when we think about, well, why is there such invariant persistence? We assume an equal contribution from each parent. Marital assortment is going to be crucial to intergenerational correlation. And I'll show you later that there is very strong evidence that there is equal contribution from each parent. Because the intergenerational correlation then is going to depend very much on the correlation in characteristics of parents in marriage. If that correlation is 0, then the correlation of the child with either parent can't be greater than a half, presuming that both parents are contributing to the child characteristics. And it can only approach a level of 0.8 if the marital correlation has to be at least 0.6 and potentially even greater than that. And so this finding of very strong persistence is also an implication that there must be very strong assortment in marriage in order to create such persistence. It turns out again, though, when we measure explicitly what the marital assortments look like, for occupational status in England, they're 0.38. For years of education, around 0.4, and for income in modern societies, around about 0.1. And so again, as I say, if you looked at the explicitly measured variables, you would think that actually there is not particularly strong marital assortment. So how can we observe what the true correlation is of people in marriage? And it turns out that conveniently, in England, the marriage certificate has been unchanged since 1837. It gives the rank of profession of the groom, the bride, the father, and the father-in-law. There's no space to enter mother or mother-in-law's professions. The bride occupational information is mostly absent from 1837 to 1940. And even now, 10 to 20% of brides actually are listed as having no occupation at the time of marriage. What the marriage register looks like is illustrated in this mixed picture. This is one from 1837. And you can see that in the middle there, for rank of profession, these are two servants who are being married. And we also get information on the literacy of the parties marrying by whether they can sign the marriage certificate or not. And we also get information later on what their ages are. So they're actually highly informative, these marriage certificates in England. And then here's one from 2020. And as I say, it's exactly the same format and recording the occupations of the fathers, though sometimes fathers are listed as retired or dead. How can we use that to estimate underlying correlations in marriage and occupational status? Well, if we assume the true connection of the father to the groom and the father-in-law to the bride is B, that's the true intergenerational correlation of status. The true assortment in marriage, the correlation there is R, and that marriage is being formed between grooms and brides. Basically, at least in England from 1837 onwards, this was an assortment that was done by the parties getting married. And it's going to be emphasized here that brides typically were aged 24 or above in Britain at marriage in this period, and grooms aged 26 and above. And mostly they would not have been living with their parents in recent years. They would mostly have moved out. And so there is a good deal of evidence that there really was kind of assortment by the bride and the groom. Then in that case, we'll get the other associated correlation between groom and father-in-law of RB, and between bride and father of RB, and then father and father-in-law of RB squared. And what's going to happen in practice when we look at measurements of these things is they're all going to be attenuated by measurement errors, and these measurement errors can be different for parties involving men versus women and for cases involve men versus men. And so you can have different sets of measurement errors, but we can assume that they're all the same whenever two males are involved, and they're the same whenever two females would be involved. Or sorry, when a male and a female are involved. And then what we can do is we can estimate the true marital correlation as the correlation of the groom to their father-in-law divided by the correlation of the groom to the father. Because the correlation of the groom to the father-in-law is, and the figure here is theta RB, and the groom to the father is theta B. So if you divide one by the other, we'll get the underlying correct correlation. And it turns out that in this data, the average value of that number is 0.78, and that's unchanged all the way from 1837 to 2021. And this is just illustrated in the figure here. And also the dotted lines show the 95% confidence interval. And so it's a very strong and stable social correlation. And as I say, very consistent with the possibility that there really is very strong persistence of status from one generation to the next. And that then brings us to the question of, well, how is social ability transmitted across the generation? What's the mechanism that is allowing such high rates of persistence? And that's normally assumed to be through parental investments in care, social investments, family cultures, and family networks. But in this case, why is it so unaffected by social changes across this long interval in Britain? And the data implies that this reason is likely because the main mechanism of transmission is actually genetic. And if we have additive genetic determination of people's social status, then the correlation in social outcomes in a family lineage will be proportionate to the fraction of the shared genome that people have. We're looking at the relevant genome. And the fraction of that shared genome will be largely dependent on the correlation in relevant genetics across the parents, which we can designate as M. And there'll be simple formulas then that will predict the correlation between any two relatives in the family tree. And so cousins, their measured correlation, it's going to be attenuated by this factor theta. And it will be h squared, which is the heritability of the trait. And then 1 plus m over 2 to the power 3. Second cousins is going to be the same thing, but 1 plus m over 2 to the power 5. There'll be a few cases where if we go down in the kind of linear line of descent, where instead of the 1 plus m over 2s, we'll have a 1 plus r over 2. But you basically get a whole set of these correlations, which all involve h squared, all involve theta, and then almost all involve this 1 plus m over 2. And we can then use these correlations to look at what the predicted phenotype correlation will be as a fraction of the shared genotype. And if we assume that, for example, m was 0.6, the genetic correlation of people in marriage on social status relevant genetics was 0.6, and the phenotype correlation, which has to be higher, was 0.8, then we'd get the pattern shown here, where if we go from siblings to nephews to cousins to second cousins, we'll see that they become having less and less of a shared genotype, but that shared genotype is still very significant, even for second cousins, because of the strong assortment in marriage. And so I have, along with Neil Cummins at LIC, spent years constructing a genealogical database in England that goes from 1600 to 2024, and now has 429,000 linked individuals from families with rare surnames. And rare surnames are just used to allow more accurate family linkage. And they're mostly constructed by amateur genealogists, but we've been checking them and supplementing them and adding much more information ourselves. And one piece of information we can get is from the electoral register. We know where everyone was living in 1999 to 2022, or almost everyone. And we can match that up with the land register to tell you the value of the house the person was living in. And such house values correlate in general with occupational status, income, wealth, and longevity. And we can check that in the data. And we norm them by region, since average values vary across regions and people are quite strongly geographically persistent. And then we just end up with a table which shows for all possible relatives in the lineage down to cousin and fourth cousins, the numbers we have, their average birth year, the birth year of their earliest common ancestor. And so once you even go down to third cousins in this data set, we're talking about people who had a shared ancestor in 1829. And then for fourth cousins, we'd be down to the 1790s as to when they had a shared ancestor. And then we get a correlation, and we can see that we can measure that with reasonable standard errors, and that these correlations are declining over time, but they're still significant, even at the level of the third cousin, statistically significant. And this figure from the PNAS article shows what this looks like for the logarithm of house value. And we also can look at what do unrelated individuals in the database look like in terms of their correlation of house value. And that nicely is 0. But you can see that you get an incredibly good fit here with implied genetic distance and the correlation in log house value. And it implies a genetic correlation in marriage of 0.57. And it implies a long-run kind of intergenerational persistence of roughly 0.79. And remember, that's very close to the number that the surname studies are suggesting. And also, this data is going to be consistent with the measures of assortment, because the phenotype assortment is going to be higher than any observed genotype assortment. But the phenotype assortment, remember, was something like 0.8. So it's quite possible that there could be. And as you can see, the R squared of this fit is actually very good. And so this is showing for people living in contemporary Britain that you can actually predict a lot about what their correlation in social status will be, even for people who last had a common ancestor about 150 or 180 years earlier. And then we can do a similar exercise where we look at the correlation of occupational rank for people born from 1800 to 1859. And again, we can go all the way down through different levels of relationship. And we've actually done it here in a way where we're typically looking at people who were born roughly in the same period. And that's, again, to make it that the measurement error is going to be similar for all of the people in the study. And now for fourth cousins, we're dealing with people who would, on average, have a common ancestor in 1668. And so the processes that have brought them to this point when they're measured after their birth in 1800 to 1859, if there's different rates of social mobility for different branches of the family tree, then you're going to have very little correlation by the time you get to this point. And what you can see is that the persistence of occupational status, the measured persistence, is actually very high. And here, the correlation, even of fourth cousins, is 0.15. No, as I say, they are extraordinarily distantly related, and almost everyone here will not even know who their second cousins are. And then if we plot the picture again of what occupational status correlations look like, and this is, as I say, is the period of Britain in the Industrial Revolution, then what we actually observe here is, again, that they fall along the straight line that is predicted by the additive genetic model. And the correlation in occupational status genotype, the persistence rate is the same. The assortment in marriage, the implied genetic assortment in marriage is the same. The R squared is very similar. And so whatever is generating this data, it does have these kind of striking characteristics that it would be very consistent with a simple additive genetic model. And it turns out that there has been recently generated evidence that the genotype correlation in years of education, for example, is actually even higher than the observed phenotype correlation in years of education. As I say, this is going to be just a function of the fact that the phenotype correlation, that measure, is a very noisy measure, measured with a lot of measurement error. And so it's quite possible to have a higher actual genotype correlation than the observed phenotype correlation in this case. And it turns out that the additive genetic model has a whole bunch of predictions. And what I'm actually working on is another book on this topic, which a lot of it consists of looking at tests of this additive genetic model. There's the pattern of correlations in the family tree that we looked at already. There's gender symmetry, which is implied by such a model. And given that we lived in a social world that was highly asymmetrical through almost all of this period, that's an interesting prediction that comes from the additive genetic model. There's a prediction of a linearity of regression to the mean, that if people deviate from the mean, they should return effectively at the same rate all along the distribution. There should be a constancy of underlying social mobility rate across generations. I already pointed to evidence that that's the case. Family size should have no effect on outcomes. Birth order, again, should have no effect on social outcomes. Living versus dead relatives should make no difference. And in particular, lots of people in earlier years had their parents, one or other parent, die before they reached even age 10. And the argument here will be that that will actually not affect what the correlation will be of the child to that parent. It will not affect the life chances of the child. And then social programs in general should be observed to have little or no effect. So this, as I say, would be the extreme prediction where basically all that matters to people's outcomes is the kind of genetic endowment that they inherit. And here, if we look at the father-son correlation, and we divided the sons up into those who were less than 14 when their father died, those who were teenagers, 14 to 20, and those who were 21 plus. And then we look at the correlation in occupational status. We can see that there's no sign of any significant change in that correlation for sons who actually had very little interaction with their fathers, compared to sons whose fathers were still alive when they reached maturity. And then again, for higher education, there's again very little sign. That's the attainment of higher education. Again, the correlation of son attaining higher education with father attaining higher education is very similar for those who had dead fathers as opposed to for those who actually got to learn from their fathers or got financial support from their fathers. And it really doesn't seem to matter when the father died. In terms of gender symmetry, before 1920, women had few formal educational opportunities in a society like England. Middle-class women typically had no formal occupations. In the census registers, they're just left blank or described as wife. And the question is, well, how much did women versus men matter to child outcomes? And as I say, the problem is that for fathers, we have lots of social status measures, but for mothers, we don't have anything that measures them directly, except one thing that we'd have earlier in this period, which is literacy. So we can observe literacy for both fathers and mothers. But it turns out then that we can just substitute for the father or the mother, the paternal grandfather versus the maternal grandfather. And we can ask, does the paternal grandfather have more influence on outcomes for a child than does the maternal grandfather? And if the mother effectively has very little influence, then you should see those correlations be very different between the child and the paternal grandfather versus the child and the maternal grandfather. And again, we can, using the genealogical nature of the data, we can also substitute, instead of the grandfather, we can use the brother of the mother and the father. And so we can just check what are the connections, what are the correlations between all the various members of the family tree and the outcomes for the child. And when we do that, if we look at literacy, the circle here denotes the mother, I believe, and the triangle, the father. You can see, and the line is showing the 95% confidence intervals. You can see is there's effectively no difference in the literacy, and we can even split children up into males and females, and we still don't observe any significant difference in terms of mother influence versus father influence based on their literacy on whether children were going to be literate. If we look at occupational status using grandfathers, and maternal is the circle, paternal is the triangle, they're equally influential. If we look at higher education, again, they're essentially equally influential. And for almost every characteristic or outcome, it's also the case for longevity, that parents are almost equally influential in terms of child longevity. You do live in a kind of world of kind of profound social symmetry in terms of the influences on children by the parents. So the conclusions here then are that the kind of simple additive genetic model with strong parental genetic assortment amazingly describes the social world in England very well, at least from 1600 to 2021. One of the reasons I've actually taken up this position in Denmark is to use the very powerful register data that's available in Denmark. And it turns out that we can also in Denmark, using just people in 3 generations, fit the same genetic model with similar parameters to things like years of education in modern Denmark. And the interesting thing is that that model fits very well the data in the modern period. And here we actually extend to further relatives by going to people's second set of in-laws, third set of in-laws, fourth set of in-laws. So you can actually generate quite distant relatives. And the implication of the model is that there's very strong assortment going on in marriage in Denmark. That is a genetic assortment, which is, I think, around about 0.5 in our early attempts to fit the model. That there's a very strong implied intergenerational persistence, which is, again, close to 0.8, which we find in England. And that the social world, for whatever reasons, in Denmark turns out to be very similar to England. And we could also do this in Sweden using another set of data. And the Swedish and the Danish data are very similar. We generate the same outcomes. And so in the end here, what is actually, as I say, interesting is that the determination of social status and its inheritance between generations actually shows a kind of surprisingly law-like pattern of behavior, which is, as I say, not very usual for variables within the realm of economics. But it actually seems that there is some kind of powerful, relatively constant, deep social structure, which is producing the patterns that we observe. Thank you very much.
Professor Clark, thank you for your talk.
Hi. So, are there questions?
I have a couple of questions, actually. So I don't know where to start, but yeah, so you mentioned this idea of, not being able to change these social outcomes, right? And I think it's one of those things where it's kind of like, if you think about, for example, modern education policy, right? There's been a lot of like attempts, and I'm talking about from an American context, especially in kind of a multiracial context. And there's been quite a lot of attempts to improve, group differentials, individual differentials, and most of these have failed. And you can obviously always ask the question, like what's the underlying mechanism that's causing these things? But you don't really have to answer that question just to note that, these education policies have failed. And I think that's kind of one of the things with this notion of, again, I don't know how to put it, but maybe determinism, where it's kind of like you don't really need to know the underlying mechanism to note that attempts to improve X, Y, or Z have failed.
Yeah, I can actually comment just a little bit on that. There
Mm-hmm.
actually are some very good educational institutions now, which where they do controlled trials of educational interventions and where they publish all of the results. Because the problem in that literature was that people were only publishing results when they got some positive effect. And when they do that, the typical educational intervention produces a gain in the target variable of 0.04 of a standard deviation. And a lot of them produce significant negative outcomes. And so the evidence that we are actually able to improve things like math education or various other forms of education through the types of interventions that people know about is actually not strong in any way. And there's also studies that look at the effect of adding years of schooling to people. And there, the worry is in that literature is that they don't publish the results, which actually show negative effects of actually adding more years of schooling to people's outcomes in terms of employment, earnings, wealth, whatever. But actually, if you look at that literature, there's actually very weak evidence that increasing amounts of education for a particular cohort of students actually changes their social outcomes in any significant way.
Right, right. It's very, I think a lot of education, like policy, and still uses many of these like kind of results that don't work, and then they don't work, and all of this money is kind of thrown down the drain. But I think it was maybe Charles Murray who made the point that even if these policies didn't quite work, maybe they have other kinds of effects, like Head Start. Maybe they provide a place for children to go to after school, even if they didn't necessarily improve, their schooling. But that's a different question. The other comment that I wanted to make is so again, you kind of emphasize this sort of additive genetic model, and I think a lot of, if you look at like modern population genetics research, especially large scale genome wide association studies, genome complex trait analysis, and so on and so forth. I think Oakbay et al. 2022 polygenic prediction of educational attainment within and between families from genome wide association studies in 3 million individuals is a good source. And the point being is, I think for a lot of period, we didn't really quite have the data sets or the technology to do these kind of studies, but now we do, and we see a very similar kind of thing with education and intelligence, which is it's not some like nonlinear effect. It's not epigenetics. It's a pretty straightforward, just an additive genetic variance. And I was just kind of wondering how much, like, have you sort of explored, these kind of models? Of course, you can't really do that, when you go back, but, in the modern context.
Yeah, it should be very clear that I'm not a quantitative geneticist, but I'd be very interested in that literature, and particularly in, for example, claims that the that there were effects of the genetics that people didn't inherit in terms of their outcomes. That is, the genes they didn't inherit from their parents could also help predict what their outcomes were. And it seems pretty clear in that literature that this is actually probably us providing information as to what the true uh, genome value of the child is, because the genetic predictors we have are very imperfect, and so there's a lot of genetic value that we're not observing, and that really that was what was happening there, was that this was just providing information, and that there really is very little sign that there's a direct genetic effect of parents' genes on children through the family environment. But I agree, the literature actually is very interesting, and lots of stuff going on now in terms of outcomes there.
Right, right. And I hope I have one more comment that I wanted to make, which is, the very notion of, social status and how you measure it is kind of normative, right? You have to choose, what kind of measures, whether you're doing occupational status, education status, and so on and so forth. And I'm kind of wondering, how meaningful that is. And the reason I say that is because you're a big point that you make is, these things are sort of, you have all these massive social changes. You have in a large historical time period, you have notions of class, and then in modern mass society, you don't really have a notion of class. And if class, the people still use the term class, they really only mean economic strata, right? They don't mean like laws and rules, which represent some nobility, right? I mean, in the UK you have like a monarch, but again, there's no actual aristocracy like there used to be. And so my point is kind of like, how meaningful is it to actually make these measurements insofar as like there's a lot of missing information. And like, for example, if you consider like a journalist at the New York Times, traditionally they'd have a lot of high status. You can assign them a high status bucket. But in modern mass society, someone may go viral on the internet and they may have a lot more influence on culture than this, high status New York Times journalist, and so on and so forth. And so my point being is, status seems to me much more flexible. I'd still say X, Y, and Z, even if they don't meet certain criteria that you've chosen to measure, but they still might be very influential in society. And, is that not status?
Yeah, no, so this is an interesting question about, can we have a thing, which is people's social status? But it does turn out in the data that there's very strong correlations between occupational status, education, longevity. The only thing is wealth can actually deviate a fair amount because of it can be transmitted across people, and then it depends on how many children there are. It can be, so wealth is the one thing which actually is more socially transmitted. And a kind of a reflection of kind of occupational status, for example, is the way we actually calculate what the occupational status of jobs are in this data is by looking at who marries whom. And it turns out that will generate a very powerful status measure, which will rank all of the occupations in terms of status. And then if we independently rank occupations by, well, how much education are associated with them, how much income, how much wealth, there's a correlation of like 0.9 between that independent ranking of occupational status and then the ranking which just looks at who marries whom in this society. And so it turns out then that status is actually playing a very significant social role and determining kind of and people seem to care about social status very, very much in terms of matching. And also with this data, we can look at, do women match differently in marriage in any way than men do? And the interesting thing is that the data, again, for England suggests no, that it's actually pretty much symmetrical, because there was this argument that at least in earlier society, that women would care more about social status of their partner and men would care more about appearance of their partner or youth of their partner. And that women consequently could trade up in social status through marriage. And we actually observed none of this in the data all the way back to 1837. And so people are acting in this society as though social status was a thing that they had that determined things like their occupations, stuff that determines who they marry, determines what the status of their offspring will be. And so, as I say, it really is as if there is some kind of social physics here, or there's some kind of generalized measure of status actually is a very powerful predictor of even things like who is interacting with whom in this society. Yeah, oh, yeah, no, that's a very good question. And so I did end up doing a paper with some people in Hungary, where so one measure we had of social status was who was going to medical school in Hungary, who was graduating in medicine, and that's a very high status occupation. And there, what was interesting was that you could see in the communist era that the names of people who were in this formerly elite group, which are quite distinctive in Hungary, that they did not decline in terms of those kind of regular high status positions in the society, even going through the Stalinist period in Hungary. But they did decline in representation in politics and in the army in this period. And so you can see that there definitely are, governments can have significant influences on some elements of social status. But the other interesting thing was that as soon as democracy came to Hungary, those names rebounded immediately. And they ended up in a position that you would have predicted they would have been in had the communist era never occurred. And I haven't done these studies myself. I've looked a little bit at social status persistence in China. But the widespread belief now is, despite the amazing purges of the middle class and the landlord class in China, that the elite families from before that period have actually strongly rebounded within Chinese society. And there, as I say, you ended up killing a large fraction of the previous upper class. But it's still the case, though, that the descendants who didn't get killed are now actually often the lead people in local villages, or lead people in industry and government ministries and stuff like that. And that whatever effort they made, it didn't succeed in kind of ending that kind of the prominence of that particular class of people. So you can definitely affect social mobility if you're willing to shoot most of the previous ruling class. And so you will certainly observe that. But this claim just is, if you go to countries with more moderate regimes, such as Denmark or England, it's surprisingly difficult for government policies to have much effect on rates of social mobility.
Dr. Clark, I have a question, right? When you cited the 0.79 value for the transmission of social status, is that like a global value? Like, do you see like short-term like regression to the mean when it comes to social status?
So, if you measure, explicitly social status, you'll always see much more dramatic regression to the mean. But the problem is, as I say, that when we look at explicit measures, the people who end up with high social status are often those who got lucky in the previous generation. And so that social status then doesn't reflect their true underlying social capabilities. And so then you have to distinguish then, which is what is happening to this underlying status of people. And as I say, once we switch to looking at a group level of people with certain surnames, then we actually can see what that underlying movement is, right? And so there is this important point that if you just take a bunch of people who look at the years of education and look at the years of education of their children, you won't observe this correlation of 0.8 between those two sets of years of education. And that's just, as I say, because of the nature of the data, that if you take a bunch of people who have, who are now at high levels of status, but most of them got lucky accidents, or a lot of them got lucky accidents that put them at that level. And so you will observe that kind of short-term rates of social mobility. But the point here is that if you're predicting social mobility in the long run, then the underlying parameter that matters is this 0.8 parameter. And that's what's going to tell you what will happen, for example, to particular social groups. So if you have a group in England, such as the Huguenots, then what's actually going to happen is their tendency to return to the mean. That's going to be dictated by that underlying parameter.
Right, I was thinking about this as a test for like the additive genetic model versus like a wealth model, right? in the additive genetic model, you definitely see sort of like short-term fluctuations, but like in the long term, like the transmission is like it's stable, right? Or like if you think about wealth, sometimes there's short-term fluctuations in wealth, and then like if that's the thing that's determining social status, like you wouldn't see this like long-term trend, right? Like at some point, like if you go bankrupt, and then like your kids will like suffer from this, right? Or like in the genetics model, you will be able to get like a long-term prediction.
Right. I mean, in the genetics model, the point would be in elite families, there will be children who do poorly, but then their children will do surprisingly well, right? Because it's often caused by these
Right.
accidents, right, and these fluctuations. And the other very specific thing that will happen is if the correlation between a child and his father is 0.5 in terms of, say, years of education, the correlation between the child and the grandfather will actually be 0.5 multiplied by 0.8. And so it will be 0.4. And so it'll be surprisingly high because it turns out that once you start looking at multiple generations, there's only one period where you get this short-term fluctuation. And then all of the other periods, if you're moving backwards, what matters is that underlying correlation. And that's what, as I say, you're estimating in the genetic model. And then that short-term fluctuation is actually created by the theta and the h squared element in the model. Okay, looks like we're out of questions.
Oh, yeah. Does anyone else have a question that they want to ask?
Well, thank you very much for listening to my pitch, and good luck with the rest of the conference.